Hey, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about a really cool book. It's called Genius Isolated: The Life and Art of Alex Toth. Alex Toth is one of my favorite illustrators and comic book artists, definitely an inspiration to me as an artist. But I'm also not alone in that. After his career, he has inspired generations of other comic artists and illustrators. He's most known for his sort of reductive, simplified approach to drawing comics. But in this book, it's really cool to see the evolution of sort of how he got there. And you get to also see points throughout his career where you really started to see him kind of come into his own, and the Alex Toth that we would all come to know stylistically start to really show within his body of work. So this is just going to be like a flip through of this really cool book. I'm not going to go over every page. There's so much in here, but hopefully it's enough for you to sort of enjoy and get inspired by if you're already an Alex Toth fan like I am. Or if you're not familiar with Alex Toth's work, I think this video will be a really great introduction to an amazing artist. In the past, I've made a couple of other Alex Toth videos. I'll link them here and down below if you're interested in watching those as well. And let me know in the comments, are you an Alex Toth fan? If so, what's some of your favorite work that he did in comics? There's a lot to get to in this video. I don't want to talk too much, but I do want to say that if you stick around to the end of the video, I do a little Alex Toth-inspired drawing. So I hope you stick around and watch that as well. Okay, so Genius Isolated: The Life and Art of Alex Toth. This is very much like a biography / art book of Alex Toth. He definitely inspired many artists, many comic artists and illustrators and animators after him. So for that, he's definitely left quite a bit of an impact on that tiny sliver of the world. So let's get into it. It's a really great book. Bought this a couple of years ago. It's a smaller version of the bigger version. This book is part biography, so there are sections with just words, but we're not here for words, are we? We're here for the pretty pictures. So I'm going to skip all that stuff and get to the artwork. If you are interested in reading more about his biography, there's some interesting things there for sure. I would definitely recommend this book for that. This book really focuses on his earliest work in the very beginning of the book, and then starts to grow with him throughout his career. I love seeing the earlier work of artists that I admire, just to see how they've grown, how quickly they grew. Was there a turning point in their career when things just started to click? These pieces right here are from 1947 and 1948. So Alex was a very young man during this period. It's kind of interesting to see the very opposite of what Alex Toth actually became. I mean, obviously you can see a lot of the little seeds and nuggets of what is to come, but there's a lot of little feathering and very tiny lines, little details. Much of that stuff, as he grew as an artist, became much more simplified and reduced down to only really the important lines. But it is very interesting to see that at this stage, like for instance, these two pages right here almost look very much to me like Charles Burns, if you're familiar with Black Hole. This very, very slick feathering approach on the inks. Those very thick, luscious ink lines always reminded me of like inking with gasoline or dark chocolate or something like that. Alex Toth seems to have always been good at drawing hats, whether it's for a cowboy hat in a Western or mobsters wearing top hats. I think when you grew up in this era, similar to like Will Eisner, characters, because people in general just wore hats a lot, so you kind of just had to know how to draw hats. And whenever I'm confronted with having to draw any kind of hat, whether it's a top hat or a cowboy hat, it's really, really difficult. It's one of the hardest things to draw. So I always marvel at these older artists that seem to have been able to draw hats from all different angles. This is from above, this is from below. It's so well done. They're so believable and well drawn. So already here, still early on in the book, we're getting to 1949. And I feel like this is where you're first really starting to see like Tothisms happening. He's really starting, something is starting to click where some of the earlier work before this still had a little bit of like a naive amateur approach to drawing figures and inking. You could tell he had a much more careful hand. There's a lot of imitation of perhaps other artists at the time that he was uh, hired to look like or aspiring to look like. And then here, things become much more natural, relaxed. You could even just see in these poses, these are incredibly well done in terms of body language. Even the way the hands are holding the guns in such a relaxed manner. Every character is sitting and standing in their own unique way. And then, of course, the lighting and the inking and the line work in general is really starting to feel so much more confident. This, to me, is starting to look like Alex Toth coming into his own a little bit and really just kind of figuring things out. Also, with books like this, it's so cool because this is just, a scan of the original, not cleaned up or anything like that. It looks here like this arrow that's coming in, that's on fire. It looks like it's a paste up from a separate sheet of paper. And that's just the stuff that I always love seeing. Of course, you could see the whiteout or the white paint, anything to cover up some of those mistakes and corrections. This is just the beauty that you get in an artist edition or any kind of art book. Romance comics, romance, romance, romance. That was the name of the game in the 40s, it seems, 40s and 50s. If you were a comic artist or even just an illustrator illustrating like novels. So you get to see some really great older work by guys like John Romita as well as Alex Toth, kind of cutting their teeth in the comic industry by doing a lot of romance comics. So the book says that this story here comes from the early 1950s. So we started just earlier in the book at 1947, 1948, and you could see only a few years into it how much more sophisticated his work has become, just in terms of composition, use of black and white. Obviously, his figure drawing has improved dramatically, and just his comfortability with visual storytelling in general. It's starting to get much more cinematic with the choices in terms of the angles that he picks, the confidence of using silhouette in the way that he does with these really interesting compositions. When I see stuff like this, it's very inspiring because it just goes to show that with practice, with dedication, and with strong observation, you can really improve in leaps and bounds in such a small amount of time. You'd have to imagine that at this point in Alex Toth's career, he was drawing quite a bit, a lot of comics, a lot of covers, taking on whatever job he can get. So with every job, you're really just improving more and more. It really starts to come together. If anyone was ever asking me to draw a comic that had primarily jet fighter planes chasing one another and exploding in the air, drawn from all different angles, I would probably shy away from it very much. But it seems like that was one of the more fun things for Alex Toth to draw. He was really, really great at, of course, action adventure type comics, but specifically fighter jets and cars, which are two of like the hardest things to draw. And he seemed to do it very effortlessly. And it makes me wonder at this time, this was in the 50s, what he was using for reference, if he had just little figurines or if he was subscribed to any kind of aviation magazine or something like that, it's likely that it was a mix of those two things, because of course this was pre-internet and pre any kind of like 3D digital models. So it only makes this stuff more fascinating and even stronger, in my opinion, because so much of this was done, all of it was done, of course, traditionally, and without the aid of any of the shortcuts that we might have today as far as reference goes. And then I, of course, love all the use of zip tone here as well. It just gives black and white art like this just that extra dimension without having to rely on any kind of color. Look at that. Just kind of cutting right into the zip tone there for the clouds. That's just such a beautiful composition. When you get into this era of Alex Toth, where he's really clicking, everything's starting to click in terms of his style and his approach, it's almost as though every panel could be its own beautiful illustration. They all work together as a whole, but you could separate any one of these and it's just a really beautiful illustration. I mean, look at that, the simplicity of that and the way it's used with the zip tone, this right here, that low angle. He's able to get so much character, acting, and emotion in these little like half silhouettes. Okay, so this part of the book is really cool because this was like a unfinished, unpublished story. And because it's unfinished, we get to see some of his process here and some of his pencils right next to the finished ink work and the lettering. So it gives us an insight into just how rough his pencils were. He wasn't noodling, he wasn't getting really super detailed with his pencils. He was putting down just enough to indicate where things were within the composition and just enough details so that he felt comfortable enough to start then inking it. And you can see just by looking at this fully inked plane next to the more rough penciled planes, just how much detail and the way the whole thing really just came to life in the inks. That's a really confident inker, someone who's drawing with the inks rather than just tracing over his penciled lines. The pencil lines are just there as the basic structure to make sure that everything's in the right place, and then everything else is really just coming to life with the inks. That is so inspiring to me, and it's something that I strive to do with my own work and my process. It's also great to see just how amazing of a letterer he was when you look at a lot of his correspondence letters that he would have with artists back and forth. It just seems like this was his natural way of writing, which is kind of insane. He just had his own comic book font. So opposite to me, my handwriting is just atrocious. So I'm always impressed by anyone with great handwriting. And this is just really great comic book lettering. And then here's some fully penciled pages. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't think that this was probably detailed any more than this before he would just start going into it with the ink. And as far as efficiency goes, that's a really great approach because it's going to, save you a lot of time instead of fully penciling a whole page and then fully inking on top of that, especially if you're the same one who's doing both. And Alex Toth and others from this era were very prolific. They were doing many, many, many pages a week. And so I think this was one of the ways in which they were able to be as prolific as they were. This is a great example of the bold sort of reductionist approach that Alexander Toth, as he is mentioned here, became known for. There's a real confidence to his inking approach where black is just fading into black. So this police officer's hat right here is just fading into the black background. The use of dramatic lighting like this panel right here is just beautifully done. A character's hair that might be darker is just expressed as fully black instead of doing any kind of fancy feathering. And to me, when I see artwork like this, it just feels like it's right on the page. It's very, very grounded. You could color this, and I think it would look great if the right colorist were coloring it. But I feel like it's 100% done and realized in this very strong black and white state. If you had to read this in a little zine size, 5 by 7, I think it would read just as clearly as it does here. I know I myself am definitely inspired by this kind of art and try my best to utilize this kind of visual thinking here. This is really cool because this is an example of Alex working with an inker, which I don't think we always, at least me, I don't always associate Alex Toth as just a penciler and someone else inking over his work. I think, as far as I know, most of his work, he inked it himself. But here are some pages inked by John Salardo. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that artist. I'm wondering how tight these pencils were, knowing that he was going to be working with an inker. I wonder if he handed off pencils that were just as rough, or because he was working with an inker, if the pencils were a bit tighter. But with pages like this, him being inked by someone else, it does read much more as a collaboration rather than like a pure Toth page. Here's some more examples of Alex being inked by someone else. In this case, inked by Mike Pepe. I've definitely heard of Mike Pepe. I think he inked some of the Marvel and DC stuff back in the day. But it's a really interesting look because, like I mentioned before, it feels much more like a collaboration than a Toth page. I could see bits of Toth here for sure in terms of composition, panels like that. That's very Toth to me. Of course, the silhouetted panel, but the execution and even the detail of some of the faces, certainly these faces, they veer very far from pure Toth. But yeah, there's some really interesting things like this. This panel right here doesn't even look at all like Toth. I could see where perhaps, 70% of this page, especially this panel, was really realized very much by the inker Mike Pepe, because you could see bits of compositional stuff that remind you of Toth, but like faces like that definitely don't read to me like a Toth face. But again, just the visual storytelling alone is so incredible. And of course, hats, incredibly drawn hats and suits, collars and ties. Those things are so difficult to draw. This is actually really interesting, and I think this is the only place that these John Fury stories are featured. It says in this book. It's a little bit difficult to understand because I'm not familiar with the multigraph printing process, but there's a description of it here. And essentially this John Fury strip was what Alex Toth was doing for, it was like the military newsletter. This is while he was in the military. I think he was stationed in Japan. And because he only had access to this multigraph process, again, something I'm very not familiar with at all. Maybe some of you might know about it a little bit better. Let me know in the comments if you do. It seems like he was restricted very much on how detailed he can get and how he was able to actually pencil and ink it, because I think it had to be drawn, from what I understand, on a certain kind of wax paper with a certain type of pencil, and you couldn't really noodle all that much or get that much detail. And so it seems like that kind of restriction, if anyone was going to make that work, it would definitely be Alex Toth. And just to put this in perspective, this is the mid-50s. So he had already started his comic career in the late 40s and then seemingly got drafted or joined the military and was stationed overseas for a certain amount of time, but still in some capacity keeping up with the comic practice, which is really awesome to see. And it seems like that was a bit of a tradition back in the day. I know Will Eisner was at war, still making comics for his military newsletter as well. So it's cool to see that that the military would utilize some of these guys' talents while they were away overseas. And it's just really cool to see this stuff. He would do one page every week. So I think this was like a weekly strip. And from what I gather in some of the writing before this, is that these were drawn at actual size because he couldn't draw them bigger and then shrink them down just based upon the printing equipment that he had to work with. So to me, this stuff is just really, really interesting and really cool to look at. I think that creativity, it really comes out of parameters and restrictions and rules and all that kind of stuff. I think being creative, the last thing you want to tell a creative person is like, yeah, do anything you want, whenever you want, however you want to do it. I think maybe from an outsider's perspective, it seems like that's what us creative people would want. We don't want any rules. We don't want any parameters. But in fact, it is those very parameters that inspire creativity, because we get put inside of a box and then we have to find our way out of that box. And that, I think, by definition, really is creativity. So it's cool to see how Alex Toth made this work with whatever restrictions that he had. And also awesome to see that on a weekly basis, while in the military, he was still coming up with ideas for stories, and it created this character, John Fury. And it seems like it's just sort of like a weekly adventure page. But you can see some weeks here were much more broken down and simplified, much more graphic than other weeks. Of course, car chases. And you would imagine that, again, there's no internet for reference there. Some of this stuff, the way it looks, almost reminds me a little bit of like Scratchboard too. I know that this wasn't Scratchboard, but perhaps some of that multi-graph process was similar to a Scratchboard approach. I don't know. I'd imagine that doing this in the mid-50s was instrumental in him furthering his understanding of, like, you know, simplifying and reducing lines and storytelling down to the bare necessities. All right, so anytime I look at artists that I admire, Alex Toth obviously being one of them, it just makes me want to draw like right away, especially when I see like art books like this. So I think what I'm going to do is draw this John Fury character. I think he's a really cool, like, adventure detective character. And I'm really fascinated by the way he was able to do a weekly adventure story. So inspired by the John Fury character, I'm going to do a little John Fury pinup or something like that, and see if perhaps I can utilize some of Toth's approaches and skills when it comes to drawing and inking. This will be obviously a very humble interpretation, that's for sure. I'll start penciling something in and see what happens when we get to the inks. I don't know how loose I could keep my pencils before I ink them the way that Alex Toth would do his. I try to keep them pretty loose and not, you know, over labor them. Try to keep some life in my inks as well, but I'm not at that level like Alex Toth was in terms of just being able to put like real basic shapes down before I start inking. Maybe there's like some sort of explosion happening behind him. Alex Toth is really good at like puffs of smoke. I'm no Alex Toth, so I'm gonna have to pencil just a little bit more before I feel comfortable enough to start inking. I got to work out that hand there holding the cigarette, and a little bit more of the detail of the face, and just overall some of the figure a little bit more. So I'm going to go in with something a little bit more exact, like a mechanical pencil here, and get a little bit more detail in, especially while I look at some of these other drawings of John Fury, so I could get his face a little bit more accurate. So from that John Fury comic, here's a really great example of Alex Toth doing one of the things I think he does really well, which is draw explosions harder than you might think to just do, especially in black and white. And this is a really great example of that. So I'm going to kind of reference some of that to put in the background of my version. So it's time to start inking this piece now. As far as I know, I'm not exactly sure what Alex Toth used to ink. I think it was more of whatever was on hand. I heard some things that he didn't always use the best materials to ink with, things that didn't really age well with time. But I think that a lot of the stuff that he inked was with pen. Whether or not that's true, I'm going to use one of these zebra pens. So I'm at least going to outline it with this, and then we'll see where things go after that. So that's the basic outline of the character. But I think in the vein of an Alex Toth approach, a lot of this stuff is going to be black. I'm going to black out a lot of the suit, and I'm going to try to utilize the bits of white, like the cuffs, the shirt, his hand, the vest, things like that, to make the suit really pop. So like using some of that negative space to describe the bigger silhouette of the suit and pants. So a lot of the Alex Toth approach isn't just, oh, just put everything in black. There's a method to that madness, if you will, where the black is there to describe things. Similar with the cloud of smoke, I'm kind of just outlining the areas that are going to be white, and then everything else is really just going to be this big black puff of exploding smoke. But where I put some of those white highlights could help make his figure pop a little bit. Okay, so I was inspired enough to do that black going into black, and I think it worked out pretty well, trying to utilize some of the things that I have observed from Toth's work, where it's not just haphazardly covered in black. There are areas of white used to describe the surrounding areas. So that's cool. I feel pretty good about that. I'm gonna go in and do some Toth clouds back here and see how that works out. All right, well, this was a really cool book to look through. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about what you might have saw in the video, about Alex Toth's work in general, if you have any comments about it, please do leave that in the comment section. If you like this video, hit that like button and let me know. It's always fun to make videos like this and look through artists' work that I really like. I know I certainly get inspired. I hope you get inspired by watching a video like this as well. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.